Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. Years ago, when I was a child, Thursday night was, for children of our age, the big night for television, because that was the night when they had Top of the Pops. Now, listen, I'm revealing my age here. I'm going back to a time when we only had 3 television channels and growing up in Northern Ireland. And there on Thursday night, Top of the Pops was basically the only popular music show that was aired. And, I used to sit through, I was so full of anticipation, I used to sit through a science-based program called Tomorrow's World that I wasn't even interested in, just to make sure I didn't miss a single moment of Top of the Pops. And there would be the countdown, there would be the revealing of what was the #1 hit single at the time, and then there would be the different bands would play and everything else. And now it was all mimed. I don't think any of it was done live. But there's one thing I particularly remember, something that we all thought was normal at the time, which now we look back on and see how totally inappropriate it was. But you would have these disc jockeys that would be presenting the show, and in between every song they would be there, and there was a lot of teenagers in the studio with them, and somehow it would always be the young girls, and it would be the pretty girls. And so you would always see these men 30, 40 years old with their arms around 2 15-year-old girls and whatever, talking to the camera, and the girls looking up adoringly at them. And somehow nobody saw anything wrong with this. This was seen as acceptable behavior, as how celebrities behaved. Of course, today's a very different day, and we look back on that and realize how creepy that was, particularly whenever there's been quite a number of allegations made against some of those presenters and disc jockeys about how they exploited their fame to abuse and pressurize young women and young teenagers into sexual situations. But what that shows us is that something that back then looked normal, now we realize it's actually quite creepy. And this draws into focus something that actually is very basic to Christian belief. And that is this, that morality is not determined by how society looks at things and whether they're acceptable or not, but rather at how God looks at them. So, for example, there was a time whenever society tolerated slavery. Most people thought it was fine. It was actually Bible-believing Christians who led the fight against slavery. Why? Because they didn't look at something the way and ask, is this acceptable to society? They looked at it through the lens of the Bible and said, is this acceptable to God? Now, here's the point I'm making with this, is that when you believe that we are created in the image of God, when you believe that there is a God who is the creator and author of this universe, then there you have something called absolute morality. Things are right or wrong. They don't change from being right to wrong or being wrong to right because society changes its mind or looks at them differently. And you know what? In the same way that we look back now to the late 1960s, early 1970s when I was a child and see how creepy that behavior was, I am sure there are things that seem perfectly acceptable to our society today that future generations will look back on and think we were absolute barbarians to allow them to happen, because society operates on a relative morality. In fact, people who reject the existence of God and reject the idea of God being a creator and a Lord and a God, they would actually embrace a relative morality. Now, that doesn't mean that they're immoral. They might often live better lives than many Christians, but they are not living a morality because it's fundamentally the right thing to do, but rather they feel, well, this is how we've evolved and this is how society would say that we should be. But you know what? We need to cut beyond that. There's a crying need in the world today for people who will walk in true righteousness. Not righteousness that's dictated by the fashions and the changing standards of society, but a righteousness that is based in the Word of God. A righteousness that is based in the love and the compassion and the grace and the forgiveness and the mercy of Jesus Christ. Christians changed the world for the better when they chose God's righteousness above the relative righteousness that we see around us. Christians can change the world again if we will accept God's absolute standards of right and wrong rather than being led by what society says is okay or not okay. I pray that today, in the decisions you have to make, in the ways that you have to speak, I pray that you will be guided by God's presence and his standards of absolute righteousness. Please join us again next time for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.